Status quo bias. What is the status quo bias and how does it influence our decision making? What is the status quo bias? Status quo bias is a heuristic that is used to help the brain streamline people's decision making. It does this by causing the person to prefer an option because it's the default or norm. Another way to think of it is by doing nothing or maintaining the current position. However, there is a problem as the option that is gone with due to the status quo bias oftentimes has the worst outcome. A classic case study of status quo bias is when Coke decided to change their formula to a better tasting version. There was enough of a taste difference that people wanted the old taste back, despite the fact that the new Coke was better, causing Coke to release the old Coke taste back into consumption. So how can status quo bias be explained? There are some theories that try to explain how status quo bias happens. First is that status quo bias is caused by a combination of rational decision making, transition cost or uncertainty, cognitive uncertainty, and psychological commitment. Basically, the people fall into the trap of the status quo bias when the costs or outcomes are unknown and when other processes like sunken cost or regret avoidance are also happening. Another theory is the endowment effect, which is when an option has more value because it is owned. This theory is used to try and explain why people stick with the current option due to the status quo bias. Finally, there is loss aversion, which occurs because people weigh up decisions in expected gains or losses, but the losses become weighted more heavily. Another different idea that tries to explain why the status quo bias influences decision making is by two ways: choice overload and attention capturing, meaning that we choose the status quo either because there are too many options to pick from, or that people pick it because it grabs our attention, because it is the status quo. Add a thought: the status quo bias. Though the status quo bias often causes people to pick the worst outcome, it does not always need to be that way. One way to overcome the bias in a group setting is to use the reversal test or double reversal test. Basically, in this test, people are asked to think from the other side. Think, what would the outcome be if we reversed our thinking? Or what would it be if we implemented it and then took it away? If the person can't explain why it shouldn't be done from the opposite view, then the decision-making process might be under the influence of the status quo bias. Individually, people can reduce the influence of the status quo bias on decision-making by being aware that it does exist and be willing to put in the effort or resources into changing from the status quo.